This is Shalimar on steroids. Xerjoff 1862 Polo is a discontinued fragrance, and even when it was in production, it was a Harrods exclusive. The story is that it was first handed out to royalty or noblemen or whatever in a charity event in England. Thereafter, it became a Harrods exclusive. Fragrantica, in fact, doesn't have a listing for Xerjoff Polo 1862. And in fact, I'm doing this video because I think it just might be helpful to anybody else who might come across this bottle and who might be considering blind buying it. This is basically Shalimar Purom, a version of the great perfume Shalimar for men. It took me a very long time to figure that out because when I was reading the notes of Xerjoff Polo, the heart is supposed to have leather and iris. I think for a long time, it's like I wasn't letting the perfume come to me. It was more like I was going toward the perfume looking for leather and iris. When I was going at it that way, it's as if it was eluding me because I wasn't really getting the leather and the iris. I mean, I was getting something powdery, sure, but if when someone says iris, you end up thinking about Dior Homme Intense or Dior Homme Parfum or Prada L'Homme Intense or that sort of thing. I was looking for that kind of iris and I wasn't getting it. And so my inability to smell a really strong leather and iris made me feel initially kind of like disappointed because that was something that I was looking forward to. It took me a very long time, four wears actually, in four different kinds of temperature. The first time I wore Xerjoff Polo, it was a warm afternoon, 31 degrees centigrade. It wasn't something that I expected to smell, having been familiar with a couple of fragrances from Xerjoff. It really struck me as something that had a very old school vibe, a very vintage vibe. Well, since I like vintage anyway, that wasn't exactly the problem. What eventually became the problem that warm afternoon was that it was so warm that the powdery aspects of this fragrance became really exaggerated after about 4 hours. After 4 hours, it turned into something that I really found difficult to enjoy because it was just too sandalwood powdery, kind of like antique cabinet. And I can't say that I really enjoyed it, which was such a bummer because Xerjoff is a brand that I really quite admire. I love Alexandria too. I love Naxos. Prior to Naxos, I hadn't experienced a fragrance that was just that stellar. I mean, I didn't know that that kind of um, refinement was possible in perfumery. Ever since then, I've kind of like held Xerjoff up there. Of course, when I tested more of their fragrances, I realized that it's kind of like a hit or miss. Like some Xerjoff fragrances are not going to be for you. Like, for example, Kobe. Maybe in another video, I'll talk about Kobe, but it just really didn't work for me. Anyway, the second time I tried 1862, it was cooler. I was beginning to stop looking for the leather and iris and just let it be. That's when I started to like it. But still, it wasn't particularly totally convincing. I wasn't blown away. The third time I tried it, the weather was much cooler and it was in fact raining. It was a very cool evening and that's when the magic started to reveal itself to me. I began to really like it. This is now the fourth time I'm wearing it, and right now in the Philippines, it's 26 degrees centigrade, much cooler. I'm really liking it now. And only tonight did I figure out that Xerjoff Polo is a male version of arguably the best fragrance that has ever been created, Shalimar. When I was looking at the notes, they do have a lot in common. Of course, there's no citrus opening for Polo 1862 after like 30 minutes. If you're not very careful, you could mistake one for the other. Of course, there are major differences, which is why it's a for male version. It's not a copy at all. First difference is that Xerjoff Polo is so much beefier. I feel like Shalimar feels like a very light shawl that you wrap around yourself. The scent of Shalimar, the wearing experience of it, I would describe as something like a layer hovering over you. Whereas if we're talking about Polo, Xerjoff is more like a coat. It doesn't hover; it really settles. Why do I think that they smell similar? Apart from the fact that, well, to my nose they do, is that recently I watched an interview that was done in another channel with the perfumer Cecile Zarokian, and the interview was about amouage material. And in that interview, she was talking about the use of vanilla absolute. The way she described vanilla absolute was kind of reminding me of the way the vanilla in Polo was behaving, also, the way the vanilla in Tiziana Terenzi's Chiron was behaving, because it wasn't a very effusive vanilla. It was more like kind of like intense and contained. Then, over the next couple of days, I came across an article which was written by Miguel Matos in Fragrantica, in which he was talking about material. And in that article, he described Vanilla Absolute as something that possessed the qualities of being leathery, animalic, warm, and spicy. So if that vanilla were that, then it makes perfect sense. If my hypothesis is correct that vanilla absolute was used in Xerjoff Polo, then it makes sense why they're the same, because Shalimar has leather, it has civet, which would be animalic, and does it have spice? No, it does not. Shalimar does not have spice, but it is a mystery to me why when I smell it, same with 1862. I get the suggestion of spice. At least as far as published notes are concerned, there's no mention of any spice, and yet there it is. And I think that it has everything to do with the use of vanilla absolute. So, if indeed Polo 1862 was created with vanilla absolute, and vanilla absolute has those aspects, then it makes sense. Then the comparison between them becomes perfectly logical. They have iris in common, they have leather in common, they have something animalic in common, they have vanilla in common. As far as the resinous aspect is concerned, I think that's where they diverge. Someone in base notes said that there's something that he or she wouldn't be surprised if Xerjoff Polo has benzoin. I wish I had more experience with benzoin to say something of value to that observation. But as it is right now, I'm comparing them, and I can very much imagine a Poponax in Shalimar, which is a published note for it, and I'm not really getting that in Polo 1862. So they have lots of things in common, and they're very different in that Shalimar opens with that famous citrusy opening, whereas Xerjoff Polo opens more with, you know, the truth is, Xerjoff Polo opens as like one big bang. They did structure it to create a top of basil, mint, and green notes, but frankly, I wasn't really getting those notes, and I thought for a time that maybe the bottle's so old that the top notes have disappeared. But then when I smell it, there is indeed something that's kind of like green, but the green is very abstract. I suppose because it's a surge off, possibly. It's just too well blended that it's very, very difficult to tell the different notes apart. When you spray surge off Polo, it comes to you as like one big bang. So in some ways, it will almost feel as though it's linear, but it's not linear because after 4 hours, it turns into something else. Anyway, upon spraying, all the notes are there already. They're all doing their thing. And it's very difficult to tell iris from the leather. It's all very unified. I made the mistake of thinking that there was no basil, or that there was no mint, or that there wasn't really that much leather, etc., etc. But this is the fourth time I'm wearing it, and so I'm kind of like familiar now with the way it dances. When you spray it, everything's already out, and it's just going to be a series of exits. How would I describe the character of Xerjoff 1862? It's almost like somebody who's pretending to be humble. There's a feeling of understatement, which is funny because it's a very loud understatement. In some ways, it's almost like self deprecating. It's an opulence that wants to be quiet, but the way it wants to be quiet is, in fact, very loud because it's a very muscular fragrance. It's very strong. The longevity is through the roof, and it projects very, very powerfully. But even though it's performing like crazy, the scent profile itself is, in fact, kind of like vintage. And we're not talking about like vintage in the sense of 1980s. We're talking vintage in the sense of like the early days of perfumery thanks to Shalimar. I shall spray some more. So I just did 5 more sprays after one spray here. And yes, it is very apparent to me that there is something green. There is the basil. The basil in Xerjoff, it's not the savory kind, it's more the herbaceous kind. And so it's not off putting in any way. Green notes, yes. Basil, yes. Previously, I never got the mint, but now that I'm in this wear, I am getting the mint. And those notes are smelling perfectly natural. It's opulent while also self deprecating. It has a Shalimar vibe, but beefy. Shalimar on steroids. Compared with the other fragrances from Xerjoff, there's something about Polo that's more understated. But the funny thing is, because it is a muscular, beefy beast, that feeling of understatement is tuned up to a volume that's really rather loud. So it's almost like a contradiction. It's a very, very loud understatement. But in terms of personality, it's almost like I would almost describe it as self-deprecating. It's like somebody who has um Christ, what is that vehicle? It's like having a Range Rover and you're taking pains to hide it so that your friends won't see. It's but then the back of it is peeking out of the garage and they can see it. But then you try everything to conceal that kind of wealth. So it's kind of funny that way. And I do stand by that observation that the moment you spray it, everything really is out there. You already smell the patchouli, you already smell the sandalwood, the musk, the leather, the iris, the vanilla, which is vanilla absolute, so the musk. All the notes upon spraying, like maybe a minute, 2 minutes after spraying, they're all out there already. If you're a frag head who's building a collection and you understand that Shalimar is a very important fragrance in the history of perfumery, then I totally recommend that you jump on an opportunity to get a bottle of Xerjoff 1862. It's an unforeseen take on Shalimar. In some ways, con is that it's not very original, but at the same time, who would have thought that somebody would do a take on the iconic Shalimar and push it beyond its being unisex into something that a man can very comfortably wear? Now let's go to the reasons why perhaps you shouldn't get Xerjoff 1862 Polo. After 4 hours, especially when the temperature is really high, powderiness becomes really exaggerated. I suppose it all depends on your preferences, but I really do not like powdery fragrances. I am willing to suffer that pain, however, because the first 4 hours is just to die for. Another reason not to get it? Let me think. Very probably it's overpriced. It was rare to begin with, and so right now it's probably even more rare. Am I gonna sell this bottle? Hell no. Never, 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 never. I'm so happy because I bought Shalimar really to get to know the fragrance because I feel like I don't know anything if I don't even know what the iconic fragrances smell like. And the surprise to me was that it's really, really, really so unisex, and I ended up wearing it to wear it, not to test it, not to study it, not to know it, but it's something that I really enjoyed. And since I just got a 50 ml, the presence of this bottle kind of like takes care of the need for another bottle of Shalimar, for, at least for the for the next year or so. Another difference in terms of the temperament of these two fragrances with Shalimar, I mean, it's no longer a granny scent to me, but every time I smell it, I still get the sensation of a person who has one eyebrow raised, like that sort of thing. That kind of vibe is entirely missing in 1862. 1862 feels like more grounded, and it's like Shalimar is a fragrance that elevates the user, whereas Polo 1862 grounds the fragrance wearer. 1862 is not for everybody. If you don't really like fragrances that are like modern interpretations of old time classics in perfumery, then it's not going to be for you. You have to have a solid appreciation for vintage fragrances if you're gonna like Xerjoff Polo. All the other Xerjoff fragrances that I've smelled, have never had this strong a tendency to come off as vintage fragrance. Not even for all the old world associations that Xerjoff has, it still feels very modern. This also feels modern, but maybe the first time you smell it, it will be almost unsettlingly vintage. Special, I think so. Yes.